The Sherlock Holmes Advent Calendar. An Odyssey Through Jerusalem by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. 3. Viennese Blood. When Holmes knocked on the locked door of my compartment the next day, in a rigid and somewhat overzealous way, I wanted to turn him down at first, as I still felt overwhelmed from yesterday. But a glance at the clock told me that I had already slept well into the morning anyway, and the sun was shining through the window, blinding my tired eyes. "All right, Holmes," I barked. "I'm awake." "Then get ready," he shouted back through the door. "We will reach Vienna shortly." Obviously, I had grossly misjudged the situation and again got into a hurry. I quickly got dressed, packed everything up, and was ready just in time when our train actually arrived at Vienna's train station named after Empress Elizabeth of Austria, wife of Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria. I was lucky that this was a terminal and that the train would come to a definite halt there, making an involuntary continuance of the trip impossible. Holmes, who had been waiting in the narrow corridor in front of my compartment, looked at me and my rushed appearance and said, "There you are, at last. You should go to bed earlier. Getting up at a civilized time would be easier then." "Thank you for the hint," I muttered to myself, took Holmes's suitcase, and continued with both our bags towards the exit. The train came to a stop, whistling, and the doors were opened. On the platform a dense crowd formed at lightning speed, and we were carried by the crowd like a wave to the entrance portal of the station in Maria-Hilfer-Strasse, where the people dispersed. We were in one of the suburbs of Vienna, outside the former Lienenwall, which was a former outer fortification and nowadays rebuilt and level as a street, the so-called Gürtelstrasse. Carriages were standing ready for the arriving passengers from the station, and we also quickly found suitable means of transport that took us to the city centre, since our next train to Constantinople would start the next day. The British government had spared no expense and accommodated Holmes and me in one of the best hotels. Diagonally behind the Imperial Royal Court Opera on the magnificent Ringstrasse, where the Vienna city wall, which had been stormed in vain by the Ottomans, once stood, was the Hotel Sasha, where a respectable suite had been reserved for us. We retreated to these to freshen up, then we went back down to have lunch. The dining room was filled with international, obviously well-heeled guests, and a somewhat unfriendly waiter assigned us to a table. Holmes browsed through the menu for some dish that reminded him of English cuisine, and when he found what he was looking for, he ordered something called Tafelspitz, supposedly the Emperor's favourite food. But in reality, only beef cooked to death. Very British indeed. I, for my part, wanted to take the opportunity to approach the Wiener Schnitzel, a veal fillet breaded with flour, egg, and grated breadcrumbs, deep-fried in clarified butter. When the waiter finally served us our plates, Holmes looked over my dish sceptically. "You're a doctor, Watson, aren't you?" he said suspiciously. "That is correct," I replied. "What are you trying to say?" "Do you consider this stuff to be an appropriate diet from a medical point of view?" my friend continued. "If this is the main dish of Viennese cuisine, then one should not be surprised that the Austrian army has lost all the wars of the recent past. The soldiers must be overweight, short of breath, suffer from severe high blood pressure, and somewhat tired from such a heavy meal. This can't be good for a healthy vascular and circulatory system, and to make it even worse, it is served with potatoes marinated in bone broth with bacon cubes. This is not a salad, but suicide." I had to laugh at my friend's remarks. "I didn't know," I replied, "that you have recently become an advocate of healthy eating. But you are right. The Austrians probably lack any awareness of this. Just wait for dessert from Bohemia." After I informed my friend about the nature of sweet pancakes, he refrained from eating one. In the end, I also preferred to leave it at a modest piece of the in-house chocolate cake, while Holmes was content with a cup of coffee. While sipping on his Viennese mélange, he picked up one of the local newspapers, the current issue of the Neue Freie Presse. After leafing through it a bit, he said, "There seems to be an interesting political conflict here. The Vienna City Council has apparently already elected a conservative politician named Karl Luger as mayor several times, but the Emperor simply refuses to acknowledge him. That seems a little undemocratic to me, I noted. If the candidate has a majority, the monarch should take note. Theoretically, yes, Holmes replied, but there are probably good reasons for this. Mr. Luger, who describes himself as a Christian social, is apparently a big enemy of the Jews. In fact, it does not seem very promising to make him mayor in a city where 10% of the inhabitants are Jewish. Catholicism is also deeply rooted here, and its anti-Jewish traditions mix with modern secular anti-Semitism to create a dangerous mixture. Let us hope that pogroms will not be on the agenda again soon. This prospect seems too pessimistic to me, I replied. Many Viennese Jews are well integrated into society and make important contributions to the economy, science, and art. It is impossible to imagine life without them. Nor should you forget that Mr. Luger will not be in office in Vienna for long. The Social Democratic Party has a veritable stronghold here which is unparalleled on the continent, and its leader is a Jewish doctor, a certain Victor Adler. Only the questionable electoral law prevents a majority for the Social Democratic Workers' Party. Holmes shook his head. You think too linearly, my dear Watson, he claimed. It is quite possible that social democracy will then perish alongside with Viennese Jewry. However, the more I think about it, the downfall of the whole of Austro-Hungary seems imminent. You are a real prophet of the apocalypse, I replied, smiling in amusement. What brings you to this adventurous prediction? Vienna is thriving. There are world-famous artists and researchers, and Austria-Hungary is still a major European power. Standing in the sand, Holmes continued my sentence. There are nationalist and ethnic conflicts, social problems that turn the entire Habsburg Empire into a powder keg, by the way, not unlike the Russian Tsarist Empire or the Ottoman rule. Didn't you notice the atmosphere? People seem to take it with decadent humor, but the downfall is certain. Then he handed me the newspaper and added, I found another interesting article here by a gentleman named Theodor Herzl. Have you heard of him? I denied and returned the newspaper. I don't understand any German texts, as you should know. Excuse me, I forgot, Holmes apologized. In any case, Herzl is pursuing an ambitious project that sounds a bit like utopia, but also carries a certain logic in it. He has come to the conclusion that the assimilation of Jews into European society has failed, as can be seen from centuries of persecution and discrimination. In this respect, they would always remain a foreign body. Therefore, the Jews must constitute themselves as a nation, as their own people. The European Jews should leave their countries and found their own state. That amounts to deportation, I replied. It seems to me that Mr. Herzl and Mr. Luger should get along well. Holmes smiled. Not at all, my friend, he explained. You are misunderstanding Herzl's concerns. He himself is a Jew and strives for emancipation and self-determination. The founding of a Jewish state, as he himself calls it, is intended to ensure this, a new home for people without a homeland. Of course, some of these views are met with rejection, but also with a positive response. Soon, an international organization is to be founded which pursues Herzl's goals. The movement is called Zionism. And where should this Jewish state be established? I asked skeptically. According to unconfirmed rumors, Holmes whispered, our own colonial minister, Chamberlain, allegedly offered Mr. Herzl an area in East Africa. But of course this is nonsensical. The answer to your question is obvious. If this whole project is to make sense, the new home can only be the old one, and we are currently on our way there. Palestine. After all, God promised this land to the Hebrews. Honoring your newfound religious zeal, I replied immediately, that is hardly a reliable basis for a colonization project. In addition, the desired area has long been inhabited by other peoples, Arabs of Muslim and Christian faith, but also by remaining Jews. We have already talked about it. Are these people to be expelled? Finally, I would like to point out that our mission is to stabilize the Ottoman rule over Jerusalem, not to establish a European Jewish one. Holmes answered with a wave of his hand. I'm not saying that I share Mr. Herzl's thoughts. As far as I'm concerned, religions are personal matters. They don't provide a good basis to build a nation. The members of a nation can follow different faiths and yet form a unity. That would be the preferred way, for people to coexist peacefully. Nevertheless, the reality is different, which we, as part of the Christian majority, may not perceive as such. If life in Europe is indeed made impossible for the Jews, emigration is a logical step." "I'm afraid it would just create a new problem," I replied. "Palestine is already unstable, as we can see from our current mission. What will happen if millions of newcomers from Europe settle there and demand the establishment of their own state? This can only lead to a major conflict. The authorities in Palestine are already overwhelmed by the current conflicts." My friend nodded in agreement. "We'll see. In any case, you are right about one thing. We should devote ourselves primarily to the current situation in the Holy Land, not to visions of the future." We finished our lunch and returned briefly to our room before taking a walk through Vienna's city centre. The magnificent building somewhat contradicted my friend's prophecies of subversion, and the coexistence of the denominations also seemed possible. Vienna is home to a large number of Christian churches. In the centre, of course, is St. Stephen's Cathedral, but also a whole series of synagogues and Jewish houses of prayer. Finally, we reached the so-called City Temple in the Seitenstadtengasse, in a sense the main synagogue of the Jewish community of Vienna. And here we should witness an instructive incident. As we were looking at the magnificent facade, we heard screams to our left. We immediately turned around and realized that at a distance there was apparently a physical altercation going on. The fight was unfair, as we saw 4 men beating and kicking an elderly gentleman who was recognizable as an Orthodox Jew by his clothing. He fell to the ground and was further maltreated by the attackers. Immediately, Holmes and I rushed in the direction of the group. "Stop, immediately," shouted Holmes in German. But only contemptuous remarks followed. "Don't interfere. The Jewish pig only gets what he deserves." I hesitated for a few moments, and then I took my pistol out of the halter hidden under the jacket, pointed it at the men, and slowly walked towards them. Now the attackers scattered within seconds. Holmes and I reached the victim lying on the ground, who had suffered a severely bleeding head wound. With our handkerchiefs we tried to stop the bleeding, but it was in vain. They were immediately soaked in red, fresh blood, and it continued to flow across the pavement and onto the street. Alone, we were helpless. Holmes had informed people from inside the synagogue, and the rabbi's carriage took the injured man to a nearby hospital. We also left the number of the room we stayed at in Hotel Sasha for the police, just in case they wanted to contact us, so we could serve as witnesses. Then we went back towards the Hofoper. We walked in utter silence, because we were both deeply affected by this anti-Semitic aggression we had just witnessed. It was just a sentence that Holmes uttered, and which I answered with a nod of the head. "Do you understand it now, when Mr. Theodor Herzl says that Jewish blood is running over the Viennese cobblestones?"